So today we're going to be sorting out this wiring loom here for an MG. It still has all its smoke left in it. So before we even try to install this thing, we need to double check this against the old harness to make sure everything is the same, because this car is very close, within 20-something numbers of a changeover point in the production that was a wiring harness difference. And as anybody around MGs should know, that production changes, even though they give you a specific chassis number, that if you're close to either side of that number, you could potentially get the wrong part, even if you do order by a chassis number. So we need to double check that. Now we know, because the catalog shows the chassis numbers, that we're that close to a changeover point, but also this book here, original MGB, is a very good resource for this. There's literally 10 pages of production changes by chassis number based on the factory records. I mean, even some of the smallest little changes are reflected in here. And for this chassis number, on the wiring harness, it says here that a fuel cutout inertia switch changed to type 481. Wiring harness modified to suit. So that's the part of the wiring harness that we really need to be looking at to see, is it just a difference in length of wires? Did they change something else? That's what we got to look at. So we got both wiring harnesses strung out next to each other here on the floor to compare them. Now the big difference we're looking at is this here, trying to make sure that these two wires here are the same, and they do look exactly the same, except for they didn't include the plastic connectors for some reason on these, on the new one. But I still don't know why it's a different part number, because to me they look the same as pretty much all the rubber bumper ones I've ever worked on. So it must be a slight difference in the wiring length. But you can check out all the connectors, make sure everything looks the same. These things rarely are ever any real problems or wrong. It's just available connectors at any given time that you buy these harnesses could mean differences in how you install them. Now these connectors here, that's for the PWDA switch, which is the pressure differential warning, have not been available ever since the very first one of these I've ever done, and I've done at least 12 of these. So they always give you just these. They push on to each terminal. They work just fine. It's not a big deal. But then this switch here, this is for the buzzer of the late car. This connector hasn't been available forever. And also for the sequential seatbelt warning controls have not been available for years. So what they do is they just give you a connector that is available with another connector and pins. If you want all that hooked up, you cut this off, pin them all into this connector, and make a little adapter harness to go into this. Now when you are ordering a harness, they do not come with any light bulbs. So if you want all new light bulbs, order new light bulbs with it. And if you're doing the dash harness as well, which we're only doing main here, those come with different light bulbs. And it is noted within like the Moss catalog or the British wiring websites that they are different bulbs. You got to order those to go with them, because it's a more modern style bulb than what this is. This connector has always been available. Never had to do anything with these yet. They're just black instead of gray. As you come forward here, everything looks fine. They do not come with new fuses. If you want new fuses, you need those too. And they originally used what they call British slow blow fuses. They're not exactly the same as American fuses. So if you want new ones, order those while you're at it. Also, the connector for the alternator. Now in this particular case, this is a late car. They can be different on like early rubber bumper cars. They had a different size terminal on one of these on the earlier rubber bumper cars with the three terminal alternator, but this is the only thing that's available. So if you have an early rubber bumper car, this is probably not going to have this, and you'll have to take this connector off of your old harness unless you've already put a new alternator on it, because that's the only thing that's available is this style. And this connector here is your fan switch. The late cars just use these terminals here. The early ones used a terminal similar to the PWDA switch, and they will give you the same connectors as the PWDA switch. You can just slide them in and they will work fine. Another thing too is you notice a lot of this stuff already has the sleeves on them, but mostly it's just the double sleeves. Whenever they're singles, they usually don't include them. So you should order a handful of those, because you're likely going to be replacing some of those as you're going through the car. So you want a handful of those on hand. So while there is much less harness on this side, the dash side of the grommet, than there is on the engine compartment side, it's actually easier to go from the inside through, because these connectors here are all pretty big and it's hard to get through that little hole, especially since you're coming through this side. There's an oval hole that you got to work through, and then several inches back is this hole. So it's really hard to get up in there and push these through that way. So I always go from this way. So you just got to really take your time here, because as you come through, as you start pushing this stuff through here, it's going to get hung up on everything up in there, especially if you got a charcoal canister like this car has. This stuff's going to get hung up on that. So you got to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, or have a helper on that side helping pull it through. And as you pull it through, you just got to tuck wires through. And then when you get up like this stuff here, when you get so far in, you can tuck this one through. And as you get up here, then you tuck this through one at a time. You keep slowly pulling it through, and take your time. So we got this part way up through there. You can sometimes pull these things backwards, sometimes pull them forward. Look at the branches here to know partly which way to go with it. But yeah, take your time getting the stuff through here, because if you get impatient and you start pulling this wires through here too fast, you can easily chafe the harness or individual wires on the hole here. There usually is a little bit of a burr there, and you don't want to do that to your brand new harness. So just slowly feed this through, work it through a little at a time. And if you do have a helper, that can make it a whole lot easier, but you have to communicate really well with your helper so that they're not pulling too hard and possibly chafing something. So now sometimes, no matter how careful you are, you're still going to get a few marks on the wires, because that edge of that hole the burr on the edge of that hole can do surprisingly easy damage to the wiring. So be very careful. And now at this point, this is where you need to start looking at all the little branches and remembering when you took it apart, where did these branches come off at and what direction did they go in? And sometimes you'll have to actually twist a harness a little bit to get things to actually go the direction you need them to go in. So poking it through this little half hole here in the core support is a lot easier, since it is kind of basically a flared hole. It goes through there a whole lot nicer. And I kind of like to start here in the middle and kind of work with, okay, we know this is all going to hook up here, and we know that this has to come in through that P-clip here, and then this has to come down this way. And in this particular case, since this was all undercoated, you can kind of see where the harness was ran, and it helps with the memory of it. So we got different P-clips that hold it at the different places. You can start putting all those in and get it kind of solidified, and then start going through the wiring harness or the wiring diagram and start hooking everything up one by one according to the diagram. So I'm not going to sit here and make a super long video of working out every single wire and where they all go and showing you everything. I'm just going to show you some of the basics and some of the things to look out for. Well, I like to start, like I said before, with right around the fuse box, get everything hooked up to the fuse box, and then work out to the relays. Make sure all your wires are sitting naturally, hanging where they need to be, so that the positioning of that wiring harness is where you really want it before you put on any of the clips. Now, as far as wiring diagrams, some people love these things. These are available through several different sources. This particular one is Prospero's Garage. This was given to me by somebody a few years ago. One of the problems that I have with this particular wiring diagram is it's a 75 through 80 wiring diagram. And as I said in the last video, that's not going to really work. So basically this is a reorganized version of the Haynes manual, not the Bentley manual. Now it is reorganized, so the paths are a little bit easier to follow, and everything's color coded instead of just letters for the codes, which is why people love them. And double the size roughly, laminated so you can get them dirty, wipe them off, clean them off, hang them on the garage wall, whatever you want to do. Yeah, I understand why people like these, but I don't really use these myself. I rather stick with this information. Now, part of the reason why is when you look at these wires, you see this one has heat shrink tubing on it. These ones don't. Same thing over here. Heat shrink tubing, these don't. Now these all connect together with this connector here. I just seen somebody on Facebook the other day going, what the heck is this connector? Well, you're just taking the brown circuit that's hot all the time. All these wires aren't hot until this connector is put in place, and it connects all of these together. And why do they put it in there? I think it's for diagnostic purposes. That way you can pop them apart and isolate certain parts of the brown circuit if you're blowing fuses somewhere else or having some problems. But this is a non-fused circuit actually, so where the purple wires is hot all the time fused, brown is hot all the time unfused. So this is straight battery voltage. But if you look at the wiring diagram here, you'll see where this is that connector. See right here how that's expanded out a little bit? That bulge-like thing in the wiring, that denotes that heat shrink tubing on the brown wire. Also over here on the red, see the red circuit here? That one has those on it. This one doesn't. Why? Well, this is going to be matching that wiring diagram. So if you hook this up to the first fuse like you're supposed to, and this one to the second fuse, if at a later time you're having some kind of an issue with marker lights, which this is your marker lights, your 4 different marker lights, you'll know which one you're actually chasing on the wiring diagram to know that you're actually looking at the correct fuse. Now you got to remember when you're working on these cars, most of the time your electrical problems really just come down to corrosion in the connections. Like these bullet connectors, the sleeves here, will get a little corroded and circuits stop working, or get a lot of resistance through them, and then you build a lot of heat in that wiring. That's why these things, like these brown circuit here, this particular year range is really common for it to melt down a brown wire all the way through the wiring harness. Well, that's generally because there's too much resistance due to dirty connections. So when you're hooking all this stuff up, yeah, I'm going to take the fuse box out, I'm going to clean it up really good, or replace them if they're really cruddy, because they're actually pretty cheap to replace. And clean up all these connections before you start hooking all your new wires up to them. So those of you who are in the know and were really paying attention, you'll know that I had it on the 76 wiring diagram instead of the 78 and later, because it's a little easier to point things out on that because it's not quite as clustered. And I didn't have the wiring harness quite set right yet, so I was showing it on this side of the wiring of the fuse box instead of this side. That's because I didn't have everything quite set right yet, and I was just trying to explain the whole difference between why the wires are done that way, and I hadn't got it placed yet, so yes, I was showing it on the wrong side. But now as you move on, you get this where you're wanting it. Now when you go to hook up this ignition relay here, or starter relay, sorry, you'll notice that the new relays, or the late style relays, are marked the 85, 86, 87, and the 30, 51, which is standard for all new style relays, but the wiring diagram still has the old markings in it of W1, W2, C1, and C2. So if you're doing this, then you're like, oh crap, now what do I do? Well, if you've got this book, MGB Electrical Systems, which is a very good book if you're going to be playing with wiring, it really does explain a lot of things. There is a page in here that just does a conversion, the C1, C2, and W1, W2, and the conversion to the modern relays. You just use this, and you can look it up online and find the same thing if you don't have the book, and that's the easy way to make sure you're hooking these up correctly. One other nice thing about this book, if you don't have any other resource for it, is it shows all the wire collars. Every wire collar and what they're generally used for within Lucas wiring. And the reason why I bring that up is whenever you're doing one of these late cars, you always will have this brown and purple wire hanging out here. And you'll be going all over trying to figure out where it goes to. It doesn't go to anything. It just hangs out here. It doesn't hook to anything. And if you look in here, brown and purple is for seatbelt detect. So it would go to the warning buzzer. And if you look in the wiring diagram here, it terminates just right here. Just hangs out right here, right next to this connector. So all it does is just hang there. So just tuck it back somewhere, pull it through, whatever, tuck it in something, and don't worry about it. It was probably originally used for testing the seatbelt control unit, or to be able to make sure that the seatbelt warning light system is working properly. And I doubt anybody even knows the procedures on that anymore. So I finished everything up under the bonnet, got all the way across and hooked up everything but the horns at the moment, because the connectors just don't want to connect to those particular horns. But I got all the starter hooked up, all that stuff's done. Now we're moving to the inside here, get the wiring pulled back in. It goes behind the wiper mechanism. Got all that back in place, and don't forget to hook the ground up here. And then there's diodes that go in here. And you check the wiring, you can either take it out of the old wiring harness and make sure you get them hooked up to the same wire collars, because you have like one white and red wire going to green and orange, and then this one's green and pink to two red and whites. Or you can check your wiring diagram to double check that and make sure you get them right. Now we have another situation of these shrink tubing around a couple wires down here. Well, that's to designate the two different flasher units. One of these would be for the four-way flashers, or the hazards, and the other would be for the turn signals. Now, which is which? I believe actually the power goes to the four-way flashers first, which is the brown wire. But if you have a long flasher unit and a short one, you'd hook up the long one as the four-way flashers and the short one as the turn signals. This one has both the same, so we'll see when we're testing it if that turn signals flash a little on the slow side, because they might with the bigger flasher unit. So we go ahead and take this all the way across here, start hooking up all the stuff here, and then we'll wait. This could be all hooked up once the dash is going back in. But before that goes in, I still got to go over all of the radio wiring, because I want to double check all of this stuff, make sure he's actually got all this right. And we also know we got some loose wires that I got to deal with that aren't hooked up to anything. And of course finish the console wiring, which includes doing the little adapter harness for the seatbelt buzzer. Now, on the testing, when I go to test, now I don't think we're gonna run out of time here today to be able to get this video finished up and out to you guys for Sunday, because I'll be actually probably finishing this up on Sunday. But this is what I use. I put this on the battery and then hook this to the positive terminal. It has a 15 amp fuse in there. I put that in line when I go to test everything. So we'll turn the ignition on and work through all of the lights, turn signals, all the lower amperage stuff. Horns will blow that fuse, and trying to start it will blow that fuse. But nothing else should, unless there's a problem. And if there is a problem and it blows that fuse, it'll save any of the wiring. Until I know everything's working fine, I'll leave that in place, and then I'm gonna be ready to start the car. Now, on this wiring, if you have trouble reading the wiring harness, wiring diagrams, that's fine. Find you a friend that can read it if you want to try to do it yourself. It's like I got a friend who's really great at sales. I'm not. So I let him deal with the buying and selling and negotiating because he's so much better at it than me, but then he has me do all his wiring because I'm much better than he is at it. When I was in high school, we took the ASVAB test, which for those who are not in America, that's a military proficiency test, or not vocational test to see what your strong areas are and not. And I had never actually read a wiring diagram before that test. I scored a 100% on that test. And that's part of the reason why when I got into the military, they pushed me towards electrical and mechanical stuff, because I also scored 100% on the mechanical aptitude. So I ended up becoming a generator mechanic in the military. So that's partly how I'm pretty comfortable with wiring. The wiring diagrams on the generators are a lot more complicated than this is. And when you're working on those, all the wires are white. There are no collars. Everything has a code on it that's printed, a numbered code that you got to follow. So this is actually relatively easy in comparison.